can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hassan, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, he just said he can. Well, for me, it's not really any kind of a moral argument. Okay, he just messaged me on Twitter that he can hear me, but he can't hear you. He says he still can't. Um, are you using a USB device? Try a different USB port. Has some you mad, bro? Yeah, it's weird. Uh, again, to anybody, oh, we're offline. Okay. Okay, he can still hear me. understand why this is happening. Um, okay, guys. So I have open DMs on my Twitter. If somebody can just DM me a recommendation, that way we don't have to deal with that stupid tweet character limit. I would greatly appreciate it because I think this is an interesting topic and would definitely like to have this conversation. And I know some of the people that I'm uh, associated with online would certainly be interested to hear this as well. Can you hear him at all? Oh, sweet. Okay, cool. But you can hear him, right? No, he can't. I love how it's on your own channel. Okay. Uh, tell you what. Go ahead and take this one offline. Yeah, I'm gonna try and stream it on my channel. We'll go ahead and take this offline. Um, gotta love these technical difficulties.
Now you should be able to hear me. Yep. Oops. It's placeholder films. Alright. Yep, that's alright. Alright, now can you hear me? Can you hear me? The chat can hear me, but
Okay.
can you
So it
hear me
looks
now?
like it's working. Am I coming through?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sweet. Okay.
Placeholder, can you hear me? I know you can, chat, but I don't think he can hear me.
Cole, are you there?
Can you hear me now? You should be able to hear me. I can see in the Google Hangouts that my sound thing is going up and down.
No, Haslam, I don't hear anything coming through.
That's my mic muted. That's my mic unmuted. And I have everything right there. I can see my little sound things. I can I can see that it's picking me up, but it's not coming through to you. I don't think there's anything. How can I get this to work? Maybe if I just change it like this. Can you hear me now? No. Try a different thing. Can you hear me now? No. Just try default. Can you hear me now? So bullshit. Can you hear me now? Since I got my thing working, I'm gonna try to reset all of Google's thing. Video call. Placeholder films. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Great. We just need to reset the thing. Chat, can you hear us?
Okay,
All right.
Haslam can hear both of us, finally.
Yeah, we can both hear us, and I'll check out your Imgur picture. Better not be porn. I don't want to be banned off of YouTube. All right. Yeah. Yeah, basic German Revolution stuff. I know this. I am very well aware of the question. All right.
You're very much German.
I am. My last name is probably one of the most German ones I've ever heard in my life.
Is it more German than Hitler?
Hitler's last name is Austrian, not exactly German, but
Oh,
Rollbuehler changed from von Buehler, means a kind of like stonemason. But and you can connect me with the Masons if you want. I even have a it. It's kind of cool. I got from a book auction for $75 a authentic Masonic Bible from 1913, and it's very thick and it's a pretty darn cool thing. But anyways, back on to the discussion. So I asked you what is your basis for when government should and or should legalize something or shouldn't legalize something?
well, it really comes down to this. Do you believe that the government has the authority to prevent people from doing with their bodies what they should so choose to do?
Well, that goes under a. Sorry, was that your phone?
That was, sorry.
No, sorry, I thought we were getting feedback, but that basically goes under the assumption of classical liberalism of the idea of everyone is their own autonomous rational actor, but that's completely voided by the basic recognizable reality of people with things such as mental disorders. Should people be allowed to commit suicide and such like that? I don't believe that that is a right for people to take their own lives, as clearly that is a mental defect, which goes against their very self preservation, and therefore it becomes a matter of governments to how they should deal with that particular person trying to violate their own bodily autonomy. And this goes also with prostitution. If we're just talking about the idea of a person choosing to have sex if they want, that's a completely different thing, a completely separate thing from a person creating a career out of selling basically their body autonomy in exchange for money or whatever. We're just going to assume this is capitalist prostitution where it's done through for just money and not for favors or anything like that.
Okay, so then interesting. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm going to try and distill down how I understand what it is you're saying.
Of course.
Now, as I understand what you're saying, it's quite simply this: you have the right to do what you want, but we're going to stop you from doing things in your best interest. So
Not
it's in your
necessarily.
best interest, in our opinion, that you don't do this. Therefore, it's not in your best interest.
No, it's not necessarily a matter of self-interest. I had that discussion with an anarchist in my last stream yesterday that you can check out, but it's the idea of kind of it's not mental. It has to do with mental defection on whether people are actually rational creatures or not, whether they're going against self-interest, because the government can't say you're not allowed to, you know, be a hero and sacrifice your life for another person. It's the idea of this person has something making them unable to come to rational decisions, such as I shouldn't cut myself because self-preservation is, you know, I don't want to go on the naturalistic fallacy, but it is, kind of a basic tenet of upholding society that the citizen should have a basic premise of maintaining, life, liberty, property, especially their own. So, would you agree that it's not a mental defect if someone wants to just kill themselves and they don't, it's their legal right not to tell you why? Should they have the legal right to kill themselves for any reason they deem fit?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's take, for example, somebody with terminal cancer.
Yeah, but that's a very
There's
good reason.
no,
That's a
well,
paying
okay,
factor.
then let's say they have treatment-resistant depression.
And again, I would say that's a mental illness, and thus that impairs their ability to judge rationally for themselves, in this case, self preservation.
So basically, what you're saying is no matter how debilitating to this person that illness is, and it is a very debilitating illness, I can tell you personally, you would have that person suffer for the rest of their life with that illness because you don't believe that they are a quote unquote rational actor and are unable to act in their self interest. You would make them live with that.
That's appealing to an emotion, and it's a different topic from doctor assisted suicide. In a doctor assisted suicide, you can have a very kind of almost sterile environment where the person is basically put to sleep and never wakes up. I mean, if a person
What's
has
the
a right
difference?
to
What's the
suicide,
difference
then they also
between
have a right to suicide by whatever means. I mean, they could choose to harm themselves in such a way that doesn't actually cause suicide, but that doctors are obligated to not do harm and could actually resuscitate the person. And, of course, as you put it, self interest would actually be an even worsening self interest. So not only do they have this debilitating condition, but now they're also dealing with whatever they tried to do, maybe multiple broken bones because they threw themselves off the top of their house.
okay, so so do you believe that people inherently are autonomous, self-owning beings?
I would not say inherently because that's kind of equating humans with people, and this goes into a big, huge kind of personal philosophy thing stemming from Kant. But basically, humans inherently aren't these rational, above circumstances, principled, rational actors. It's only through a process of self consciousness, self actualization, etc., that lets them become these rationalized things. So no, I would say people, and defining people as humans, are not inherently autonomous, rational actors.
Well, I didn't say anything about rational actors. Just are they autonomous and are they self-owning? Can they act on their own and do they own their own bodies?
Um, yes, I would say they inherently have ownership of their own bodies, and of course, um, yeah, I
Okay,
would
so
say it's
my
also
follow-up.
inherent that they can act on their own will.
Okay, my follow-up then would be, even if it is an irrational act, who are you or I to stop that individual, autonomous, self-actualized, self-owning person from acting in whatever way they want if they believe it's in their self-interest?
Because then that would be a rejection of all kind of mental care for the populace. I mean, the schizophrenic person has multiple personalities, one of which will could want to hurt themselves or others, and it just kind of if you follow that line of reasoning, then it just eventually follows for the abolition of mental health care in general because it's it there's a great argument for this that I read basically against the idea of well, basically the argument it's an argument against transgenderism, but the argument basically goes like this: just because you are yourself, you don't have complete information about what you are, basically what you are on the inside, and actually who you are. You don't have complete information about yourself. Thus, you you know you can't be, no matter what, you aren't the greatest judge of defining and self-actual well, not self-actualizing, self-characterizing yourself, not as a physical thing, of course, because doctors know more, but also including things such as personality and personhood as well.
Okay, so you believe that a person can be self-owning but not self-actualized. Is that how I'm understanding you?
Yes, that's very true of of a human. I mean, if we're imagining without any kind of society and just in a Hobbesian state of humanity just as an animal, technically a newborn child, it has the most ownership of his body since we don't have the societal construct based upon biological reality of the parents owning that child's body and determining what can and can't be done to it. So technically, in this case, the child does have ownership of the body, but at the same time, we it just should be basic understanding that that child doesn't know what's best for it, and although it can act from its own impulses, and that's the closest thing a child has to its will at the time, those things can be prevented and even restricted by force for the well-being and benefit of that child.
Now, assuming that we're talking about an 18-year-old adult rather than a newborn infant, the newborn does not have any kind of developed faculty in order to perceive the world, whereas an 18-year-old is nearing the end of their development. Now, personally, I would argue that things like the drinking age and, if it were to be legalized, the age of prostitution should be the age 24, because at that point, the human brain is more or less fully developed. But that's a different argument for a different day. What I'm getting at is you or I don't have the right to say to a person, I don't like that you like to do that, therefore, because it is my personal feeling that you shouldn't do that, you can't do that.
But it's not a matter of personal emotion with it. The whole purpose of government and government society is to either, well, depending on what you define the role of government to be, but it's the basic general concept of government is to apply through social contract apply a better kind of structure of society for which people to operate under, to create their own culture within. And the age of legalizing prostitution is very important, because biggest one of the biggest complaints with legalizing prostitution is most would say if you're legal to have sex, then that would mean you should be therefore legalized to have sex for money, thus prostitution. So that would mean in the United States we're going much lower than 24. We're going to 18 for people that are within the Romeo and Juliet laws. We're going for people that are age 16 in places like Arkansas and let me see, Arkansas,
Mississippi. But then again, you also have to remember that those
well,
states are very well into the Bible Belt and have very poor education. That definitely ties into it.
well, what I was getting with in places like Arkansas, you can have legal sex under various circumstances in so low as 13 and 14, depending upon the age and marital status of the other person. And all that does is basically create a point where, okay, this person's age, it's legal for them to have sex, but another person of the same age, regardless of their self-actualizing as a person, their financial independence from possible exploitation, this other person who is even older and more so can't have that, and it opens a whole entire worm's nest of just almost assailing the very position of limiting the age of which one can have sex, and it just kind of subverts that whole entire institution. Are you there?
No, I'm still here. I'm just trying to.
Trying to comprehend what I said.
No,
Basically,
I'm trying. No, no, no. It's not that. I understand that. I understand what you said about like age of consent and such, and how it should be raised to from certain places where it is extremely low, to the point where it should be considered. Well, it is considered criminal federally, but again, the law is different than whether or not we have the right to prevent adults from engaging in this activity for money.
But again, what can we consider as adults? Because if we've learned anything, well, not anything, but one thing we have learned from the migrant crisis, especially in Europe, you can have 17-year-old Arab immigrants assault someone and they'll be still considered Asian youths according to the thing. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous to consider a 17-year-old a youth under any circumstances. Now, I'll admit, even under my thing, a 17-year-old may not have the maturity or self actualization to be considered, a man or woman in a metaphysical sense. But still, the idea of in general calling anyone under 18 a youth is just absolutely preposterous. And if you're going in this extreme individualist route, then you would have to go on a case by case basis of, okay, is this person mature enough and do they have enough self actualization to actually determine if they want to engage in sex in this manner? And again, it just I've my major in college was political science, and I had to study bureaucracy and everything like that. And almost every single thing you involve opens up a whole can of worms of technicalities, possible loopholes, etc.
Hmm. Well, in my college program, I'm going for computer science, but I'm considering a change to philosophy. But so to try and bring this back on topic, suppose okay, so let's take an example from the conversation that we were having before this started. One of your main arguments against it was that it would pressure poor people into making their children become prostitutes for income.
Oh yes, absolutely. And my whole point of that is, even back then it was a much more prevalent thing that people would have children and even be kind of self-encouraging their wife or spouse or whoever to have more children, because what they could do is, it would be, in an economic sense, it would be an investment. If we raise this child for a certain amount of time, eventually they can start helping on the household, eventually they can start helping on the farm, eventually we can send them off to a factory to add to our household income. And if you legalize prostitution and set an arbitrary age like 16, that is also just an institution that I just find absolutely detestable. The idea that someone could say, we're really poor right now, so what we could do is act as an investment, have sex now, hope to have a child, boy or girl, it doesn't matter. Hopefully it can be a girl due to sexual demographics, and raise them up to a point where they can be a prostitute and engage in that career in order to increase the family income. And I just find that absolutely just one of the worst possible ideas that a family could have, just to have children just so they could put them into prostitution. I mean, that just is absolutely terrible to me.
Okay, so you're making an appeal to emotion rather than logically defending your
Well,
position. That's something that I have an issue with. Who's to say that that necessarily would happen? Let's look at parts of the West, for example,
Well, I mean, it's happening now
where
with
it has.
any other profession. I know people now who were born just so they could raise the family's income by eventually going to work. And if you make prostitution just another job with absolutely no moral or immoral connections, then it'll become just another job on the market that people will have children to fill that role in demand.
Okay, now do you understand why people who are not looking at this from an emotional perspective find that argument ridiculous?
Well, yeah, but I disagree with their general premise, and I can also come at it from a logical premise that a society that is raising children just to economically benefit from their sexual intercourse is not a society that is is um is the word I'm looking for. It's not conducive to a high trust society, which creates a society in which people flourish and grow.
Okay, so you're looking at this as, well, it's degenerate behavior. That's the crux of your argument, is that it's degenerate behavior. I disagree. I believe that this person, because it can be a male or female, because prostitution is a universal, um, you know,
Yep.
profession. Let's look in the let's look in places in the West where they do have it legalized, like Amsterdam, for example. They have policies in place that protect the youth. They have a much steeper penalty for anybody who gets caught doing that. So, if, say, in a place where it is
Doing what
illegal,
specifically?
using children in their business.
All right, but
So
what about
let's say
children not as actual minors, but say, like, for example, 16-year-olds? If the
they
16-year-old
would
doesn't.
still count as a minor. Legally, they still count as a minor. It is the same penalty.
All right, well then, isn't
Same
that
as if
just
there
an
was.
arbitrary placing of Amsterdam based on their things, based on their age of consent laws?
Well, their age of consent law. Well, okay. Age of consent is different than prostitution. The prostitution laws in Amsterdam have it set at 21. You have to be 21 to drink. You have to be 21 to fuck prostitutes over in Amsterdam.
But to be a prostitute, you have to be
You have
21.
to be 21. Yes, you have to be a fully grown adult.
All right.
They, based off of the development of the brain, 21 is a pretty good spot. Personally, I would argue for things like alcohol, maybe 24 would be better. But again, irrelevant. Um, let's say then, for the sake of argument, that the age for prostitution were lower. Well, then you would have a much higher risk of children being used in their prostitution businesses and brothels. Having it set at 21 is a legal protection against that from happening. So your appeal to consequence that children be used in that is nonsense. That's a 21-year investment that they would have to be patient enough for it to pay off. So saying that just because a business, a new industry in a certain country where it was previously illegal, there would be children raised specifically for that industry, you're removing the autonomy, you're removing agency from that hypothetical person.
Well, yeah, and I agree, and I don't think that there's any problem with removing agency from minors under guardianships. And if you just set it to an arbitrary age where, all right, most people are mature by this point, it would create just a
It's not
very big.
arbitrary. It's based off of things that are biologically observed due to the rate of development in the human brain. 21 is a rational age for this.
Yeah, I know, but most people are, and especially even people on the far right anarcho-capitalist crowd will say it's an arbitrary thing that a 16-year-old has just as much ability to consent as a 59-year-old, etc. But would you
But
frame it like this?
do
In
you
America,
believe that people inherently have agency?
humans, no, I don't believe humans inherently have agency.
Okay, so then define human, define person.
A a human is Homo sapiens. Say, is it sapiens sapiens or sapiens sapien?
Sapien would be
Sapien
the
sapien. Whether
Homo
or
sapien
not
that
whether
we
or not
used.
they're yeah, whether or not they're conscious, whether or not they're self-actualized, anything like that, even a baby that is born without brain function and grows up, that's still a human being. A person, on the other hand, goes through a process of self-awareness to self-actualizing that lets them become more than a human. I would have. It's basically going through a lot of analysis by Kant, but basically, they. It's hard to say in just a few paragraphs because you can go through, entire senior long semesters on just analyzing Kant, but it's basically a person who acts based on principle and is not, or not, I'm using person within the definition, a human, but with Kant's thing, it's very nice because it actually applies to non human things if they ever possibly attain this level. able to act in such a way that they're not merely reactive to their circumstance and environment, and they make their own principled decisions independent from circumstance and reaction to environment.
Okay, do you believe that a using your terminology, do you believe that a human being with Down syndrome is a person?
You would have to assess each. You would have to assess each one individually because it's not a collective thing. But I would say, in general, no. Down syndrome people have not got to a point of self-actualization, and and just from what I've seen and interact with Down people, they have very minimal self-awareness on the level to that maybe of a very highly intelligent animal, such as, the great apes or a dog or something like that. I don't think they've attained the level of self awareness to begin even the process of self actualization.
So a person is not more than an object that is self-aware and can react according to its environment and its own self-interest, correct?
No, it's not a matter of reacting to the environment because even animals can do that according to Kant. It's an idea of of um of information synthesis in order to produce principled actions based upon the will that's not merely just a reaction to circumstance and environment. But let me just ask you this: do you think Downs people, let's say, they're above the age, they're 25, should a person with a Down syndrome member of their family let or let them in quotation marks engage in prostitution to increase the household income?
Should a person with Down syndrome be allowed to engage in the act of prostitution if they can understand
Well, how can you
the
gauge that? I mean,
concept? How can you gauge anybody's understanding of anything? First off, we have to, okay, if you're gonna make the argument, um, if you're gonna make the argument that they shouldn't be allowed to because they're not intelligent enough, we have to then define what intelligence is.
well, it's not a matter of intelligence enough. Surprisingly enough, according to IQ test for my race and demographic, I am very average. I think when I purposely didn't take medication in order to get the best assessment of my IQ as possible, I scored about 109. Now, for white Americans, through 108 through 111 is about the median. And I'm not an intelligent person, so to compensate for that, I need to gain knowledge by doing things such as reading more than the average person, practicing various things to learn how to do things even more. So it's not a matter of intelligence in terms of being knowledgeable, it's a matter of intelligence as the ability to recognize patterns and how quickly you're able to synthesize and synthesize and compare information from data received.
The entire Kantian argument is based off of whether or not an intelligent being, which is able to synthesize and produce results that are principled, is an intelligence-based argument.
Yes, that is true, and I just
So
wanted
if
to
they're
make
not
the distinction
intelligent enough to,
of intelligence based on IQ and synthesizing data, not intelligence in terms of how knowledgeable. I just wanted to make that distinction. Go on.
okay, so by saying that because they're not intelligent enough to do so, we can't possibly know that.
Well, we can.
Arbitrary measurements like the IQ exam, for example, last time I took it, I scored 116. I think
Mm,
it's a ridiculous result. I don't know what my IQ actually is, if that's even a reliable metric.
well, I
But
mean,
by
there.
bringing up the argument that they should be able to analyze and synthesize data, it's a very is an illogical argument. You remove agency from an actual person.
But no, it's removing agency from the human animal by acting through principles and synthesizing of data. That human is able to become a person and thus gains agency through their personhood.
Okay, so let me clarify. In my view, Kant is incorrect. All humans are people, regardless of their developmental conditions. All humans are people with agency.
False. I don't think that's true, and I think Kant is correct on that.
Okay, at what point does a human become a person with agency? And then at what point do other humans with agency have the right to remove the agency from another person who has agency?
All right. Well, like I said before, the pers a human becomes a person when he goes through the process of self-actualization, what comes about a through self-awareness. So it goes self-awareness into self-actualization into this idea of personhood the and then getting into when a person's agency can be interrupted or prevented or anything like that comes from I would say three general categories of when this can be done. This can be done whenever, we get the basic all the libertarian arguments of self-defense. So when that agency violates another person's agency, so on the self-defense argument, you can restrain someone who's trying to kill another. You can throw them in prison, take away their rights, etc. You can you can you can deny that person their agency when they no when they of course lose that agency once again, such as a mentally a crazy person or a mentally disabled person. I mean, people of course going crazy. Another thing is also if a person becomes handicapped in such a way like they take a blow to their head and they no longer have their mental faculties in order to sustain personhood. And the third instance I would say is it goes into a very kind of cultural and societal norm form norm form norm societal norm where parents and people that have various kinds of guardianship over that person, because it doesn't happen at an exact age or even exact point in biological development. A 21-year-old cannot achieve may not achieve self-actualization, but a 14-year-old may be able to based on his cognitive abilities. But yet still, parents still have the right of guardianship over that very independent and autonomous agent based on the best of their abilities up to a certain point that doesn't become child exploitation, which I'm arguing against.
Nobody here is arguing in favor of child exploitation. Let's make that clear.
Well, yeah, but I'm arguing is it could create an incentive for said child exploitation, because if you don't alter the age of consent laws, then in very many places it could be considered child exploitation to other places.
Okay, so your argument is an appeal to consequence.
It's not an
It is. It
well,
absolutely is
well,
an
I
appeal to
suppose that's
consequence.
just a
What I'm
general.
saying is that this could happen. It could lead to the exploitation of children. Having it set, for example, the way it is in Amsterdam, where it's 21, addresses that issue. And you have to understand that sex trafficking and sex work are two completely different things.
Well, I still
And
consider
for
I'm
some
defining sex
reason,
trafficking as using humans in order, like a third party using humans to gain profit from sexual work. So if a person gets sold in to slavery. It doesn't matter what age they are. They could be 39. If another person is basically pimping them out for the to kind of, get their income, I can still consider that sex trafficking.
Okay, so let's take an example from here in the States. Nevada. Guess what the age is there?
I think
For
it's 13 or 14.
no. 18 is the age of consent.
All right.
21 is the age for anybody who's allowed to be a prostitute.
All right.
This concern is addressed by being built into the law with a minimum age.
But then what's preventing other people with this argument saying that age is just a number and that a 20-year-old person who is more mature and more so on and so on able to comprehend what they're doing more so than a 21-year-old? And then if we're going down this route, I couldn't give a good argument of why this 20-year-old shouldn't be allowed to engage in prostitution, even though as an individual they are more than capable of engaging intellectually with said practice.
I can. It's quite simply put this. It's the law.
Well, then that's a
I understand
circular
that people
argument.
No, I understand that people break the law, and there are systems in place to address those who operate outside of it.
Well, then
They
why?
get caught, they get punished.
Well, yeah, but again, that I could use that exact same argument that it's just the law of why we shouldn't legalize prostitution because we've made it illegal.
Okay, the argument for prohibiting prostitution is a moral argument. You're
Not if
arguing based off of morals rather than basing it off of, does this person have the right to do this thing to themselves? Does this person have the right to
but
do
it's
this thing?
but it's not
I argue
just
they
to
do.
themselves. There can be other people exploiting, and we have seen numerous times that sexual work is often a source of exploitation as well. Let me think of
Okay, so
various
with the exception of what was it, Rotherham in England?
Rotherham. Yep.
Yeah, which was busted and a lot of people went to jail for a very long time.
And if
Um,
prostitution wasn't illegal, it'd be much harder to prosecute said people. They would have to make a case of there was child exploitation, but they couldn't use the idea of sexual exploitation for sex work as a litigation against them.
that's insane. No, if it's against a child, it absolutely would be. Okay. It absolutely would be if a child were involved.
Okay, so at least now we can both agree that children either don't have agency or their agency it is okay to deny them to act upon said agency, right?
Children do not have agency until they hit the age of 18. That is as it is built into the law, and that is as it is built into their biology, because their brain is not yet developed to the point where they can actually fully understand things, regardless of how intellectually gifted they are. Growing up, I was a very gifted child. Doesn't mean that I had agency, doesn't mean I could fully understand the consequences of my actions. Once they hit 18, if they haven't learned already, that's when they learn. So, in saying that children either do or do not have agency, no, children don't have agency.
They don't even under the legal definition of a child,
The
which
legal
is
definition of a child, which is any person being under the age of 18.
yeah, even if they're, less than a day under, a month under, doesn't even matter. As long as they're under 18, then they don't have agency, and if they do have agency, then necessary evil in order to put in place this institution.
Until they turn 18, they're not an adult. They have basic human rights, absolutely, but they do not have the right to, move out on their own just yet. They can't get an apartment because they're still a minor.
Well,
And they
most
can't do things
16-year-olds
like
can
buy
actually
lotto
sue
tickets.
for they can sue for autonomy, and some 16-year-olds can move out and the state can intervene and cut them off from parental guardianship, and that would
Only
be
under extreme circumstances.
yeah, but that would be a very strange situation where a 16-year-old would have complete autonomy and theoretically have complete economic autonomy, but yet not be allowed to engage in certain professions, even though the state has basically recognized their autonomy and agency.
Okay, there's still a child. Okay, even if a judge emancipates a minor, the judge needs to be convinced of several things, including that the child has a place to go, that they have a way to meet their basic minimum needs. And in most cases of anybody 16 or under, they wind up removing them from the parent's custody and placing them into a foster care system. Our foster care system is wrecked beyond belief.
Yeah,
Don't
that's
get me
true.
wrong, I hate our foster care system because of how terribly it treats our children.
Hmm.
But the state still has a certain amount of control over this person's autonomy. They still can't buy cigarettes. They still can't buy lotto tickets. They still can't buy alcohol. They still can't rent a car. And in some instances,
Hmm.
they still can't get a job.
Hmm.
They have to attend school regularly, just as any other minor would. So
Hmm.
the state essentially steps in as the parent, taking over and saying, this is how much autonomy you have. The rest, you must agree to this, or we will step in and take action.
Yeah, but this is just playing into kind of a spin-off of the argument I was saying earlier that the government does have a right to come in and regulate its citizens' autonomy based on factors of age and in your case you're equating age with agency. They do have a right to come in and limit people's rights and agency based on, if they have said agency or not.
It also is dependent upon their level of, biological development. Your brain is developed to the point where you can begin to understand the consequences of your actions by around age 18. Strictly speaking, this is an average. This is not, an absolute. Everybody does this at this age. Not everybody does.
Hmm.
Most people do, but not everybody does. That's why the age of 18 was selected, because this is the age where people begin to actually understand and internalize the consequences of their actions.
Hmm.
So for you to say that it's irrelevant that this person has agency when clearly they do, because they are a human being, which is a person,
Mm.
is in I don't understand this mindset. I don't understand how you arrived at this conclusion.
That not all humans are people.
Yes.
Well, human is just a a taxonomy of this specific species. I mean, I think personhood. I mean, consciousness should be an absolute requirement to even begin to assess personhood. You can have human beings that are, have never been conscious, never, you know, been able to be self-aware, yet it's still a human. I mean, you can't call a person that has been comatose from the day they were born a person, can you?
Does that human being who's been in a coma since the day they were born have rights?
Do they have individual rights? And this is, I'm probably going to get a bit of flack. I don't believe they have rights of citizenship, but I'm not talking in
Do
terms
they
of the
have
law, but
human
do
rights?
they have human rights? It's a very difficult question because they have absolutely no way of enacting any kind of rights, and the only kind of rights that would ever be applied to them would be human rights regarding others' actions upon them.
So
I
no.
have to say, I would have to say yes, they have human rights, but these human rights become delegated by the guardians of said person, this being most likely their parents, and those kind of rights are all the same rights that would apply to to basically like children or anything like that, like very young babies as well.
And if they were to wake up miraculously and able to adjust, would they have autonomy?
Yeah, they could eventually gain personhood, but if the second they woke up, no, I don't believe that they would have achieved self-awareness, self-actualization, and personhood.
See, this is where okay, so this is really the point of contention in this philosophy that I can't necessarily understand is this compartmentalization between people and human.
Human is the animal. Personhood the is a metaphysical concept that doesn't have to apply to just humans. If we meet intelligent aliens or whatever, it doesn't matter if they're aliens, it could be a species of dog. If they're self-aware, self-actualized and, able and all these other requirements, they would still be a person despite being human. I think that's a very good distinction to kind of untie the idea that humanhood necessitates personhood. We'll say you did this. Say you met an alien. We had the whole the day the Earth stood still situation, and you're meeting to and talking with a rational alien. Does that alien have autonomy, and thus would you say that alien is a person?
I would say that alien has autonomy, and I would regard that as a person absolutely in terms of the abstract concept, but I would also regard the person with Down syndrome as a person in regard to the abstract concept with agency and autonomy.
And do you consider fetuses people?
Well, interesting. Okay. Biologically, yes. Functionally, not yet.
Well, so then that would be an argument for the legalization of abortion, since killing a person is by definition wrong. Well,
Killing a person, yeah,
murdering a
killing a
person.
person or murdering a person, because there is a
Yeah,
distinction. Now,
yeah.
if we're going to go off of
I'm sorry.
killing, then
Murdering a
that would be
person is
correct.
by definition wrong. Sorry.
My personal view on it is simply this: it is not my decision to make. I would hope that they would allow that potential human to have some know we haven't forgotten about it. I would hope that that person would allow that potential human to realize their potential. For me, it is all about the potential of the person.
Mm-hmm.
Each person has potential. I view it as a value assessment as whether or not that potential should be removed from that person. And I argue, no, it shouldn't. This feeds in this level of autonomy. This person is an autonomous human being, and I'm going to use the two terms interchangeably because in my view they are interchangeable. This person has full autonomy over their body. Why shouldn't this person be allowed to have sex with whomever they want under what circumstances they should so choose? I understand that your argument of your appeal to consequence of but think about the children, which has been thoroughly refuted and debunked as if it were to be legalized everywhere in the world where it is legalized, with few exception, Thailand and Southeast Asia and in the East.
Most of the countries in
Obviously,
Africa as well.
yeah, and they also have little to no government to enforce this or their ideology such that it permits it. Here in the
Mm-hmm.
West, on the other hand, where we have strong liberal values, we understand that children cannot consent. We understand that a person's development is such before a certain age that they wouldn't be able to. We also set things in a way that it would protect the weakest among us, being children.
But again, that's
So the
assuming
argument
this system will
against
only work
is
out
logical.
if the population is already under certain cultural and moral assumptions. But the thing with law is when you're making a law, you can't assume people are or aren't going to do a well, assume are, but you can't assume people aren't going to do a thing just because you remove it from the law. You need to make it a objective standard that says if blank is done, then blank will be done by the government in response. So you can't
Is
just
that not
say,
what a law is?
hmm?
Functionally, is that not what the law is?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. You can't just assume the you can't assume the future demographics of what the institution will be inhabited by and assume, well, this works for this particular demographic and we can just completely disregard any other demographics that happen to come in. It could very well be the case that in the future Europe can get rid of these liberal values and assume this like an Islamic, or as some would put it, Islamicist ideology, which would in fact permit this, and then you would have no more barriers against this practice being happening, since you no longer have the culture or the law to dissuade people from engaging in this practice.
Which is what the UN and the European Union is supposed to be for. Now, granted that the UK is leaving, they're still under the jurisdiction of the UN. So for you to say, well, this country might change, therefore we shouldn't do it.
Well,
Is
no, I'm saying that there should be institutional protections in the case where future events might shift public opinion, and thus institutionally we have a defense against this. That's the whole idea of kind of a constitutional republic instead of a democracy. That public opinion, you have in the institution of these congressional, basic foundations, so that even if in the future the demos, the voting population at large, even if they say we can violate this person's rights, we have a basic foundation institutionally that says no, you have no institutional basis for violating this person's right, despite you being the majority, or even almost, well, if it becomes the case of nearly everyone, that the Constitution would be abolished, but even if it's the case of it's the overwhelming majority.
okay. So your argument is basically bad things could happen, therefore we shouldn't.
I'm
That's your
saying,
argument.
no,
That is exactly your argument.
I'm saying bad things are more likely to happen than not.
Therefore we shouldn't try it.
Well, yes, I mean, I can
It's an
say,
appeal to consequence.
well, yeah, but
It's an appeal to
government,
consequences rather than looking at the potential benefits. You're looking at the potential consequences.
well, benefits are
So
included in consequences.
benefits, for example, would be a new industry which would lower unemployment, increase our tax revenue, much needed tax revenue, as well as a potential population increase, increasing our birth rates, which are declining at a very rapid rate. I think we're at like zero point 0.8 children per each household with my generation.
But you're basically describing the Mali Empire. I mean, the Mali Empire, their entire export and their whole entire economy was based off of selling slaves to the Middle East. I mean, the Mali
We
Empire.
don't sell slaves.
I
We have a different set of values.
Yeah, I know, but those values can be changed with the demos. But they could make all these same arguments. It's supporting the industry that keeps our whole economy afloat. It increases the birth rate. It allows people to buy and sell property, and all these exact same arguments could be made for why the Mali Empire should have continued to sell slaves.
And in the Mali Empire, were they removing a person's ability? Were they owning people in the Mali Empire? Yes, they were, correct?
Yes, including their children and etc.
And in the West, we have thoroughly rejected the concept of slavery. We haven't reinstituted slavery since its abolition. I see no reason why it would be a concern that we would just suddenly decide to reinstitute slavery.
Well, because well, for one thing, if we're talking about particular circumstances, Europe is becoming more and more Islamic. And if you read in the various, if you read in Sahih, Sahih Muslim, the Hadiths, and all these other things, I can even bring up the quote for you of the prominent, of that really prominent Saudi cleric. You've probably seen him, you know, the guy with the white beard, and this is a quote from him. He says Islam is a part of jihad, and as long or not slavery is a part of jihad, and as long as Islam remains, there will be jihad and slavery. All those who say otherwise are, I think he says, either heretics or apostates and not true believers. So I mean, it's we have a very real possibility of this culture that not only accepts and is permissive of slavery, but openly promotes slavery to the kafirs, the non-Muslims, you know, becoming a very sizable demographic within Europe. I mean, would you would you say it'd be a good idea to get rid of prostitution laws institutionally if you just assume this basic premise of say 45% of the European people were, according to various polls and everything like that in surveys, if they said they would be fine with making with child slavery and child prostitution legal and acceptable. If you remove this idea of the cultural norms that would prevent it.
What? Okay, so if we were to change this one thing about our culture, what would make you think that our entire value system would shift?
Well,
Keeping in mind that we are not Europe.
are we talking specifically about America now and not Europe?
As far as I was concerned, we were talking pretty much exclusively about America, with the exception of the specific example of Amsterdam.
Well, I was talking in general about all of Western civilization, since the origin of the topic was from Sargon of Akkad V and all them, which is from Britain, German, and is he from Arch from Germany? But and Romania respectively. I assume we were just talking about all this Western civilization in general.
Okay, so in terms of Western civilization, what makes you think that changing this one thing about our culture would facilitate a radical shift from being a free Western democracy through a free Western representative democracy in applicable countries? Let me specify. To essentially an Islamofascist state.
Well, because of the changing in demographics. I mean, it should be pretty obvious if you change the demographics of the electorate, you change the very culture of that electorate.
Implying that those values would change immediately rather than it being a slow shift that the people would be able to resist.
Well,
There's definite resistance to the I guess the Islamification of Europe. They're
yeah, but
not going to allow this change without the proper democratic say, and that is what's currently happening now. With them importing, I think, some 1 million a year into Germany alone, yeah, Germany is pretty much fucked,
mhm.
but that is because of Merkel.
And
To say that that would
who has
change
most
the
control
whole of Western
over
society
yeah, and who has most
is
control
nonsense.
over the EU due to being the majority of the EU's economy is Germany. So if Germany
And
becomes a
Great
big
Britain.
proponent, then this is inevitably going to spread to the rest of the EU countries.
Okay, so relevant subject, since the overall topic is prohibition. How do you feel about drugs?
How do I feel about drugs? I'm assuming we're just going to be talking about illegal narcotics here.
Well, including marijuana.
Sure, including marijuana. It, it becomes a big problem because I mean, ethically and also from a litigation standpoint, I can't make a convincing argument to myself that the owning of these of drugs should be illegal, and thereby also the selling of drugs should be illegal. But on the other hand, I can make a good I can make myself a convincing argument of why it should be illegal to consume these various drugs. Not a few. There are a few exceptions to this rule, but in general, the owning and buying and selling of drugs, I can't give myself a proper justification for why that should be illegal. But the the participating in drug use, I do think should be very illegal.
Okay, so it's not illegal to own drugs, but it's illegal to use drugs, is the system you're proposing.
I don't. Yeah, I don't think there's legal justification for why a person shouldn't be able to own drugs, but I do think there can be a legal justification for why people can't use drugs.
Then you see a legal justification for people not to own drugs. The purpose of that is to use them.
No, not necessarily. I mean, for a very easy example, I always wondered what it'd be like to grow a marijuana plant. I have no interest in smoking it, but as a hobby, I grow various exotic kinds of plants. I'm growing a pomegranate tree to mangoes, etc., and I would have no qualms about it besides the legal repercussions of growing a marijuana plant and, of course, never using it.
Okay, so you're okay. The purpose for the vast majority of people, yourself obviously being an exception to this because you have some eccentric, I'm gonna say, curiosity about owning it.
Sure,
Fine.
sure.
The vast majority of people, though, buy them to use them. So the argument that they should be allowed to buy them but not use them is an argument they should not be allowed to buy them. Does that not violate that person's agency?
Well, no, because I believe people should be allowed to buy and own, say, bleach, but I don't think people should be allowed to inject bleach into themselves, and the same thing with other various things. When we talk about just basic ownership, the you have to have someone that owns technically like a say a drug repository for like the methadone rehab clinics. You have technically have to have some kind of ownership at the end of the day that owns these particular drugs, and I can't extend that and say, well, people shouldn't be allowed to own drugs because if you if say a parent that finds their kid has meth in their drawer, you, I can't fathom a it being a good system if the parent turns in the however much, let's say 10
Just say
grams,
Graham.
sure, a gram of meth to the police saying, well, you were in possession of this meth, therefore you're going to be arrested. I think, no, that person was in possession without the intent to use it, and therefore there should be no ramifications for that person owning the drugs at that time.
Okay, then
Well,
how would okay?
well,
How would
tell me,
you
can you give a justification for a person? A justification for legalizing and prosecuting a person who owned a drug but had no intention and did not use it.
legalizing and prosecuting or keeping it prohibited and prosecuting?
Well, keeping it illegal and prosecuting.
I don't believe that it should be prohibited. I am against the prohibition of it because I believe that it is my body. I should be able to put whatever I want into it.
Even if it destroys your own agency?
It would be my choice.
All right, and here I can add a little exception to your law here. If you were contractually obligated to perform a function which includes things such as parenting, maintaining job contracts, etc., you would then have create a contract situation where you would not have the legal authority to ingest or use that drug whatsoever because you have a contractual obligation, correct?
Providing that that contract had a proviso preventing such, yes, that would be correct. It has to be specified in a contract. Okay, if I have a job and that job doesn't want me to do certain things, it has to be laid out in the contract or employee handbook that I'm not supposed to do those things.
Well, I mean,
You
shouldn't
know,
that be
drug testing, for
basically
example.
implicit if you're going to use heavy machinery that you can't, that it should be implicit that when the person hires you to use that heavy machinery, you're not going to be using anything that impairs your use of said heavy machinery?
If that substance is not illegal, they have no right to tell me what I can or cannot do on my own time with the proviso that it is specified in the contract not to do such.
Well, I completely disagree because there when you sign a basic contract, you also are becoming a part of that person's workforce, and thus various insurance laws are applicable to you. And let's continue on with this heavy machinery thing. So you're a contractor and you sign with some person to build their house, and you're going to be operating a bulldozer. If you use LSD before you come and use that bulldozer, and then when you're using the bulldozer something terrible happens, like maybe you run over the other person's like wife and it results in a death, not only are you responsible for it, but through that contractual inclusion into their workforces, now that person is also responsible. For insurance reasons, creating a dangerous workplace environment, etc., etc. I mean, OSHA will just be all over that person's butt.
Well, for one, I wouldn't use LSD before operating heavy machinery. Two, I would be fully responsible and would have to accept the consequences.
But not only you're fully responsible, but your employer as well becomes responsible as well.
Right. They would have to pay out a certain amount because of the insurance. My contract would be terminated and I would be in jail.
But isn't
You
that?
have to understand the consequences of actions before you take them.
Mm-hmm.
So if, for example, it were legal to do so, it doesn't mean it would be necessarily wise, which doesn't mean I would do it.
But by
But
legalizing
what
it, you
you're
would.
assuming, though, that an average person has the common sense, for lack of a better term, of a child.
Well, I mean, yeah, most people are very not up to intellectual standards. I mean, you can just see constantly people talking about how they go in high to work and everything like that, and people doing other various kinds of recreational drugs even during breaks at their workplace, etc.
Which is in violation of their terms of employment and should result in termination.
Yes, but it should have a legal precedence for prosecution as well.
With it being prohibited, it certainly does.
But even if it was legalized, that wouldn't be again conducive to a productive workforce and a productive society at large.
Okay, if that person is doing drugs on their shift, even if it's on their break or during their lunch, they should be fired for it. Now, to say that they don't have that right is the same as saying that I don't have the right to do whatever I want to my person. I, as an individual, I, as a self actualized human being, do not have the right to do to myself what I should choose to do.
Well,
And
yeah,
this ties back into the prostitution argument.
yeah, and I disagree that things that are clearly the result of mental defection or anything like that, such as I don't believe that a person has a right. Of course, there's circumstantial things, but I don't believe a person has a right to arbitrarily like cut off their own hand. I mean, we could get into the workforce thing. if you have a contract to be a what's the word I'm looking for? I think cryptographer is the right one. I think cryptographer is the right
What,
one.
code breakers?
No, no, no. I'm referring to I guess surveyor is a proper word, but the word I was looking for were the people
Oh,
who are,
cartographer.
yeah, that's it. That's it. And if you're hired to do that, then it's you I don't think you have the right to cut off your own hand because you're breaking the contract you have signed with your employer in order to perform a specific function.
After the contract is fulfilled, though, I would argue that you most certainly do. I don't think that it would be in your best interest, but who am I to say what's best for you?
Because it's not
You're
just
assuming that you know what's best for other people and having this idea that certain things should be illegal because they might do harm.
but I'm not saying that I specifically, I'm just creating the postulation that some people know better than others what should and shouldn't be done to their persons.
Who? Who? Who?
That varies based on circumstance.
So no one then. Because, okay, so you're using a weasel word to defend your argument without having any example to
All
defend
right,
your
all right,
argument.
fine. Here's an example. A person, a person gets a loan from another person, and instead of paying it, they decide to commit suicide so that they don't have to pay it. That person is now economically a lot worse off because they don't have their money. They lost that investment, and that person who committed suicide, obviously they can't, but I don't think they could give a proper justification for why suicide is the rational course of action.
That's what insurance is for. The insurance policy that is on that person would pay out that loan. That person wouldn't have to worry about it.
But that's under the assumption that they have a general insurance policy that would cover such a thing. And that's usually insurance policy is usually for accidents, not intentional self-ending in this case.
Okay, when you issue a loan, it is insured by the federal government. That loan is insured. The person may not be, but the loan is for circumstances of that nature.
Well, then this I
It's an
think that
no,
only I think that only applies to institutionalized loans such as banks and everything like that. I was talking in a very general case of an individual person loaning money to another individual person with the assumption that they'll get that money back eventually.
and that person can sue the estate of said deceased person and they can retrieve their money. Regardless of how much wealth one person may or may not have, they do leave behind an estate by default.
Mm,
Everything they own is part of that estate.
yeah, that's true, but I mean, it could be. This is again just getting into circumstantial situations. Some people could not own it, or they could also be co-owners, in which case then that person can't ever get the exact amount they put in. They would have to come to a settlement with said co-owner, like a spouse or anything of that nature. But again, we've gone really far off of the prostitution argument and even the drug argument here. Maybe we should maybe we should try to reel it back.
I'm okay. So the point of me trying, okay, so the drug argument, for example, was simply to get you to define agency and for you to make clear do you whether or not you believe people have agency, period.
People have agency, period, and of course we differ on the definition of person and human.
Okay. In my view, I, as a person,
Hmm.
as a human, the two are interchangeable because it is something intrinsic to my being, have agency, and thus should be able to do whatever I should choose to do to my body, regardless of what other people think. If I want to get tattoos, I have the right to get a tattoo. If I want to become a male prostitute, I have the right to do that because it is my body. Therefore, it is something that is outside of other people's control. In removing agency from a person, in saying that a person is not more than a human,
No, no, it's the other way around. A person isn't necessarily human, and humans aren't necessarily.
in saying that people aren't people.
No, saying
No, no, no.
that
Okay. In saying that a human being is not a person.
intrinsically, yes.
In saying a human being is not a person, that justification then allows you to do all sorts of terrible things to that person.
Well, yeah, and then you would have to give proper evidence and proper grounds of why this human isn't a person.
In treating that human as a person, it eliminates that,
No, because
with
like
the
we agreed
exception of the
before,
truly
there are
mentally ill.
but as we said before, there are human rights differentiated from rights of a citizen.
A citizen is not necessarily the same as a person,
Yeah, I know, but
because as a citizen, my rights change depending on the country I'm a citizen of.
um,
For example, if I go to the Netherlands,
well, institutional rights, but I'm going under the classical liberal assumption that rights are God given and inherent to personhood.
I wouldn't necessarily argue God given, but inherent most certainly.
Well, that's what the founding fathers, that they put the two next to each other.
Okay, now represent your case.
Of of what specifically?
Prostitution.
That humans there are numerous cases more often than not in which humans lack the mental faculties to be persons and thus lacking personhood lack the agency to make rational decisions of their autonomy with said personhood and thus it's applicable for a third party to intervene in said violation of their autonomy in some way.
And why do you believe this?
I would just say, why do I believe this? I could give an argument of anecdotal if I've experienced people like this, but I mean, anecdotal arguments aren't very persuasive, so I would have to go with a philosophical argument. I've given all the kind of philosophical examples that I could that non-humans can still be persons and even humans can lack personhood. It's kind of all based off of that assumption that personhood is something higher than just the human animal.
And how would you evidence the claim that a non-human animal can be a person?
Um, you. This is just a thought experiment, but of course, like I said, the aliens, a person who isn't a human, coming up saying, "Hi, hey, how are you? My name is Bob. We're having nice weather today. What do you think about Kant's categorical imperative?" just just the basic thought experiment. It's not a matter of circumstance of saying within all of existence only human beings have been able to achieve personhood, therefore only humans are persons. It's just under the rejection of that assumption saying it is possible for other things, even if they haven't come to exist yet, that other things can also achieve personhood.
So, do you have any other philosophical influences aside from Kant
Oh, oh, freaking tons. Even though I
for this
found,
argument?
oh, for this argument. Um, Let me think. Kant, basic, basic structure and good of society for Aristotle, and even Aristotle acknowledged that there's people who are naturally inclined to slavehood. Let's see who else regarding this. Not really Nietzsche. Not really Hoppe. Off of the top of my head, I would say Hobbes would also slightly contribute to this with his idea of the natural state of man and why societies form in the first place.
Okay. Now, let's say for a moment that we can suspend any philosophical influence. I've done so the entire debate.
All right.
Logically, in terms of just pure reasoning,
Mm-hmm.
can you provide an argument as to why I, as an individual, should not be allowed to engage in certain activities? Is
Just
there any
really
kind of
quick, I would
justification?
like to just quickly, since we're discarding philosophy, can we just get a small clarification on allow? Are we talking about legalization, or are we talking about an objective morality?
Well,
Are we talking about a legal justification for why, or are
a
we talking?
legal justification.
All right, as a government, whether deciding whether you should be able to do this or not, a legal justification would be that, according to the evidence we are presented, that it is not conducive to a society functional to the standards that we would like preserved.
I'm sorry. What?
If I'm a government and I'm just being asked if I can provide a justification for why this should be illegal, is I think the proper logical argument would be, with evidence that we currently have available, it is not conducive to a level of crap. What was I phrased it right the first time? A society.
It was a moral argument.
No, it's a function. It's a level of functionality of society.
In what way?
Because by creating a legalization of prostitution, it sets a moral precedent for, or I'm not using moral in terms of if it's morally right or wrong, but just the
In terms
government.
of overall setting, adjusting the expectations of the culture to accept this one thing. Got it.
Correct. Yes, set this moral precedent of what can be tolerated, permissed, and and rejected within that society.
Do you accept that with time that might change?
With time, might it change? Are we asking if it's possible for it to change to that, or if it is with the current history and causality of events that have led up to this moment, if it's possible for it to happen or likely to happen in the future?
With history as it currently is, given the history of prohibition, especially in the West,
Hmm.
do you believe that it is possible that societal attitudes might change to allow for it?
within the time constraint of say 2 or 3 generations. No, I don't think it's possible for society to evolve to the point where everyone is autonomous enough to be able to institutionally remove these defenses. No.
Okay, I think you're conflating something. The argument against prohibition is not an argument for complete deregulation, to have an unregulated industry. It would be very strictly regulated, very highly taxed.
And but again, those aren't really well going into the regulation in a second, but just the idea of getting a tax benefit for that's just offering an additional benefit, not the actual justification for the legalizing or illegalizing of the problem. Saying slavery is would make us trillions upon trillions of dollars is irrelevant to the actual argument that slavery should be legalized. So the idea of taxing it is just not even a concern for me. I don't think the government should even take into consideration how much money it should make. But the idea of regulating it, if you set a specific standard for it, of say, as you want, the age is specifically 24, then you'll get even you'll get kind of a bolstering of this other side, either for people who want to either subvert or the people who are like anarcho-capitalists that says, yeah, that's a good thing, but we need to take it even a step further beyond that, and will push for even more. They'll see it as a kind of spearhead to forward that particular agenda.
Now, I have a history of disagreeing with the ANCAPs. You'll find no argument at that point. The issue that I have, though, is quite simply put this. In preventing people from engaging in certain behavior consensually, you are removing a certain amount of agency from that person.
Okay.
Oh, I am as well, by the way, for your comment. Um, in removing that level of agency, you're giving the government enough power to essentially dictate at what point an adult has or loses agency without violating any specific law.
In practice, but it's kind of going through it goes through a small transition with that. It's not only just the government that would doing this, but it also allow other autonomous agency individuals to do this, but through just basic idea of social contract, that burden of doing it becomes a necessity of the government to act upon that. But just in say there was, I can't just say if there
Do you
was no
believe the
government.
social contract can change?
Um, are we talking? Are we talking about between the exact same people, or are we talking change in general, such as demographics can change and ideas can change, or are we talking all the same people all come together and decide a different social contract?
Okay, so let's examine the concept of the social contract.
All right.
The social contract today is much different than it originally was. Social contract originally, in the United States at least, allowed for things like slavery and institutionalized racism, whereas today it does not allow for any of that.
Yeah, and that is very true, but that gets into an argument of another completely relevant point of my general philosophy, that a government only acts or should act within its jurisdiction, and its jurisdiction includes its land borders as well as its citizenry. I don't think that the government has any justification or even a practical reason for trying to, say, uphold the rights of freedom of speech for a British person, the American government. That is, I don't think they should go over and you know, aid that person, even though that British person, as an inherent right, does have a right to freedom of speech. And that goes into the point that ties it back of jurisdiction, which back then blacks weren't a part of the jurisdiction of the U.S. government in the sense that they weren't a part of the citizenry. Thus, they didn't have to enforce the rights of citizens. All they had to enforce was property rights, which is it's kind of ironic that it's the property rights. Of course, the property itself doesn't have rights, but it's the property rights of someone else. Do you understand what I'm saying? That the difference between citizens and non-citizens in government jurisdiction of um of acting.
You no, you've. I must have missed something when I was listening to you. I must have filtered out a word
Okay,
or
I
something because all of a sudden we went from the social contract here in the States changing to British common law.
well, what I'm saying is the social contract itself didn't fundamentally change. All that changed was the jurisdiction of who was a part of that social contract. Before, the black slaves weren't a part of that social contract, but it was just kind of changed or updated to make them a part of it, and thus a part of the government jurisdiction of enforcement and also protection.
I would say that's a pretty fundamental change.
No, not necessarily. It happens whenever people give up or get citizenship. I mean, Hizeki Spolaski over from Uzbekistan immigrates over. He wasn't a part of the jurisdiction before, and now that he immigrates over and gains citizenship, he's now a part of the social contract and a part of the jurisdiction.
Immigration and slavery, though, are two completely separate concepts. You're equating the two.
Well, I'm equating it to just that the people that the government enforce laws over and in turn are controlled by.
No, you're falsely equating immigration to slavery. So in the beginning of the United States, this is post-revolution,
Mm-hmm.
pre-Civil War,
Okay.
when slavery, period, including the indentured servants, because that's a form of slavery as outlined by our Constitution and UN international law, um, was accepted
Mm-hmm.
as part of the it was part of the social contract that this is something that exists and is perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
Civil War happens, slavery ends, the social contract and concept changes fundamentally to make it so that we're not allowed to deprive people, humans, of their freedom, with the exception of those who've broken the law. That's a pretty fundamental change and is irrelevant when it comes to immigration.
But I don't think that's particularly true. I don't think that the
Are
government has.
immigrants slaves?
If they're what? Are
Are immigrants
immigrants?
slaves?
I do believe that the government can't really doesn't really have a justification for treating them any differently if an immigrant is within the national boundaries. I mean, the only right that's specified within the Constitution to illegal immigrants, barring ambassadors and everything, they have a reason to be here and tourists. But the only right that the Constitution gives to people who are here illegally is they have a right to a trial and translator where a I don't think they use the word prosecutor, but a special prosecutor only has to give give evidence. They don't have to actually go beyond the shadow of doubt and burden of proof that the person is in fact illegal, and then they can be deported back wherever they came from.
Illegal immigrants are not subject to U.S. law, and as soon as they are discovered, are to be deported per U.S. law.
Exactly. And because they're not a part of
Legal
the justification.
immigrants,
They're not a part of our social contract. Thus, the U.S. government doesn't have to treat them like citizens.
which is why we remove them.
Exactly.
Legal immigrants, on the other hand, are they treated like slaves?
No, but then they gain a part of that social contract.
They're okay, so then what they're doing is in moving here legally, going through all the paperwork, they are accepting the social contract as it currently is.
Yes.
Back pre-Civil War, an immigrant would be signing on to the social contract, which allows for slavery
Mm-hmm.
as a free person.
Yeah.
You can't equate slavery and immigration. They're two completely different subjects.
Well, it's just a matter of jurisdiction of what people the government has the has the right to enforce the laws over, and which to uphold the rights of.
So, in somebody moving here legally, the government has the right to subjugate them and deprive them of their freedom.
No, in moving here legally, they become a part of the social contract. That's why the blacks who were here and also citizens in this pre-United States beta United States era, they could also come here, be among the citizens, and also own slaves themselves. And they were also a part of that social contract, and thus they had their rights. They had the government had the necessity to uphold their rights as well.
If they were free people.
Yeah.
But okay, so if somebody is free, do I, as a free person, have the right to deprive that free person of their freedom under that social contract? The answer would be no. Barring, of course, some violation of the law, which was uncommon as most of the slaves were brought here from Africa and from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
They were sold by the Muslims to the Africans to the Europeans. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, they were slaves.
Well, yeah, but they're just come immigrating for a different reason.
No,
Whether
they were brought here against their will.
and
That's not immigration, that's subjugation, that is slavery. You're equating two things that are not related.
so a slave can't also be an immigrant. If a slaveholder had slaves, immigrated to the United States and came here and brought their slaves, the slaves wouldn't be immigrating.
No, they would be property. Okay, as it was seen in the early United States, slaves did not have rights.
Yes.
They were not people, they were
Yes.
property.
Correct.
A property does not have rights. The
Correct.
owner of the property has rights, even if in some messed up world where it's still okay, that property was a human being.
Sure.
Therefore, that slave is not an immigrant, he is a slave. He's a piece of property.
Well, that's just going through a different technicality of I'm defining immigration as persons moving to, a person moving to a new jurisdiction, whether it be becoming a part of the citizenry or coming onto the nation state's borders and area of influence.
I understand that, and they are still human beings. However, in that specific instance, they are not people in the eyes of the government. Only the property owner is a person in the eyes of that government. You're conflating immigration with slavery by saying that, oh, well, these slaves are from a different country, therefore they're immigrants and should be granted and are then granted any kind of rights. That's the difference between an immigrant and a slave in early America, was how they got here and whether or not they had rights. If somebody brought them here as a slave, they were not given rights. They were considered property and not people. Therefore, you can't equate the two.
I still don't follow how you can't equate the two. Practically, they're both people being brought here for whatever means, whether their own will or through a will of another, and I'm just let's just say illegal immigrants or whatever, they're being brought here through their will or will of another, and a slave being brought here. Maybe they legally sold themselves in indentured servitude to feed their family or whatever for some reason, but most likely against their will, illegally. I can't really see a from a jurisdiction point of the government of the difference between those two people, barring the exception that the slave brought here most likely has the property rights of a citizen of owning said property and the government having to enforce that.
It's a question of rights. That person is not that human, to use your terms, use Kant's terms, that human is not a person. Therefore, that human does not have rights. Whereas an immigrant who's coming here legally is a person. It does have rights. That's the difference, is rights.
Well, like we said before, human beings are have inherent rights, but what I'm saying is even if a human has rights or not, they're inherent whether or not a government exists or not, that the government can only act upon to enforce and uphold the rights of people within its jurisdiction being defined by the social contract theory of what's a citizen and also their physical land borders.
If the government were to federally
Well, here, let me put it like this.
legalize,
An illegal immigrant here, does is there a necessity for our U.S. government to enforce the free speech rights of an illegal immigrant here within the states?
as soon as that person is found out to be an illegal immigrant, that person gets to, should, if the law were operating properly, assuming that the law is operating properly, that person would be detained and deported for being an illegal immigrant as being, because they're in violation of our sovereign law. Now,
Mm-hmm.
on the slavery question, do you believe, and tying this to prostitution, do you believe that the act of prostitution makes you a slave? Does it violate your personhood in any way?
Does it do that? No, the act itself doesn't, but I would say that the purpose of the law is to protect those who engage in the practice who have not achieved personhood yet.
So a person who has attained personhood,
Yes,
who
they can
is,
exchange money for sex and we call that dating.
if they wanted to do it professionally, would it violate their personhood?
The act itself, no, would not violate their personhood.
So then why keep it criminalized? For the people who have attained personhood, why keep it criminalized?
Because it should remain criminalized because it is a violation of the rights of those who have not yet achieved personhood.
So by preventing people who have achieved personhood from doing this, you're violating their rights because they should have the right to do that. They should be, in the eyes of the law, should be allowed to do that. Now, take this a step further. What
That
kind
it,
of counter argument would you provide if the federal government were to legalize it?
If the federal government were to legalize prostitution, I would say that it's creating an environment that encourages exploitation of humans.
Even if it's a consensual act.
Even if some acts of prostitution are consensual, yes, it's creating an environment that incentivizes even the non-consensual acts.
So then a person does not have autonomy if, according to the law, they're not allowed to perform certain acts as a as a con, as a consensual contractual engagement. In preventing people from doing that as a profession, for example, you are violating their personhood by disallowing it.
Yes, and that's a necessary evil in the same way that taxation violates people's rights, but it's a necessary evil in order to maintain the functional society.
Is taxation theft?
It is not theft, but it is a necessary evil.
Okay, just sorry, I just had to throw that in there for any ANCAP that might see this.
Of course, and I'm not anarcho-capitalist at all, by the way. I had a debate with one last night, and you should check it out on my channel if you know him. He's called the Other Guy T.
Oh, that guy T, yeah. I've been in a stream with him as well.
Yep, I debated him last night, and you should check it out. It was basically me debating the basics of anarcho-capitalism. It wasn't so much on anarchy, but whether capitalism is a suitable replacement for, governmental status society. But anyways, back on to the question. Yes, there needs to be certain necessary evils in order to maintain a functional society.
Okay, and to an extent, I can understand where you're coming from. I disagree that that is the correct way to go. Hang on.
And all right, so besides taxes, is there another necessary evil that you believe should exist institutionally?
Well, okay. Things that I believe should exist institutionally.
That's a
Taxation.
necessary, yeah, besides taxation, that's a necessary evil for a functional society.
Okay. A military that is large enough to defend our borders, but not participate in preventative wars.
All right, so why are these two examples fine for necessary evils, but the idea of having a necessary evil or preventing persons from engaging in prostitution just for the benefit of all non-persons within the society not a good enough justification?
Well, because okay, so taxation is to preserve our infrastructure and promote a functioning society in
Yep,
terms of necessary services like healthcare, education, a government essentially,
correct.
and a strong defensive force rather than a strong offensive force is for obvious reasons to make sure that if somebody wants to try and hit us, we can stop them from hitting us without invading another country.
Correct. And for prostitution, it's this necessary evil is to basically disassociate within the minds of all the people and humans within society that whenever they see another person, they don't immediately associate as that they can violates the wrong word, but they can have access to their body if only the price is right. Because in the basic idea of supply and demand, if I keep coming at you with different numbers, eventually if I just have an unlimited supply of money, I can get you to attempt to try to fix my plumbing. And it's the exact same thing with most other professions. Now, there's nothing morally objectionable with seeing a person and saying, hey, I really need some plumbing done. I'm going to keep offering money to the point where I don't think it's worth it anymore to get this person to try to fix my plumbing. And I think it would be a greater evil in society than to prevent it for a person to look at another person and say, well, person or human, because you, of course, wouldn't know just from looking at them, to say, at the right price, I can get this person to have sex with me because I really want to have sex with this person.
What are your views on pornography? Is
In
it
art, it should
prostitution?
be completely allowed, but in art, it should be completely allowed, but again, this is another one of those moral gray areas. From the idea of a hard right, such as a fascist, national socialist, or traditionalist, it's absolutely detrimental to the 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 moral status of the society and subverts the general trustworthiness of the society. But in the case, of course, of art, it should be completely allowed. But general pornography in that loophole, and I even thought about this before the stream of saying I'm paying this woman to have sex on camera. It should still be considered prostitution even though it's with a camera, but when you're making a media film of it, then it becomes a form of art and it becomes a kind of contradiction within the system, and it's a contradiction even if we have now. I mean, can you give a even legal or a moral justification for why in art we shouldn't have depiction of minors having sex for artistic purposes?
Because that person cannot consent. That person is of such an age where they cannot consent, and it would be considered statutory rape. But having two consenting adults doing that is an entirely different subject.
But
Okay, so your entire argument is a moral argument. I'm not making a moral argument. I don't believe that a
well,
moral argument can be correct.
well, no, it is a basic moral assumption that people's autonomy should not be violated.
No, it's a logical argument that my autonomy should not be violated because I am an individual human being and nobody knows what is better for me than me, with the exception of certain health choices. Then I would, if I can't come to the appropriate or factually correct conclusion, I would appeal to somebody who does have more training or knows better. It's not moral to say, oh well, it's not a moral argument to say it should be legalized or anything else, but that it is simply a logical argument saying two consenting adults should be able to do this. Currently, they cannot. This should change.
But again, if you're discarding the idea that it's a moral argument, then it just becomes again an argument of functionality that a society in which violation of autonomy is not tolerated on grounds of legalized institutions, this creates a more functional society, and that can also apply to mine, saying even if it's not prostitution or anything like that, then that creates a justification of saying illegalizing X, no matter what it is, if it creates a more functional society, then there is a justification for enacting that fulfillment of validity.
There's no functional argument to support prohibition. It's an entire industry. Okay, let's take the functional argument in terms of our society. It's a potential for a new industry. That industry could employ people, raising
Uh-huh.
tax revenues and lowering unemployment. That is a functional argument in support of abolishing the Prohibition Act on it.
And that's from an economic standpoint, but what about a cultural standpoint in which people like social justice warriors and just general communist subversives, and also what little Islamic infiltration we have into Democratic Party or whatever. That can be debated how much Islamic pushing there is for institutional change in America currently. But from a cultural standpoint, how could you justify that this won't give them a spearhead into pushing the limits to where even you would say no, this is wrong and not conducive to a functional society?
The only way I would say that it is not, the only way I could make a moral argument, a moral assessment to it, would be if a child were involved. That is the only way. Now, and provided that consent, of course, that should go without saying, but consent and if they are of the appropriate age.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the only two things that you need in order to allow this to work functionally.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are regulations that could be made that would give a lot of protection to the people who are engaging in this industry, just like there is with other industries, other entertainment industries, for example.
Yeah, but my issue would
But to
be it
say
would become
that
too interesting.
pornography is the same as prostitution, and the only difference is that it's art, what if that
If you
person who's
consider it art.
engaging in it, okay, so what if that person who's engaging in prostitution says, oh, it's a form of art?
I know, and that's a big problem because that it has been a very big source of subversion from people claiming that it is an artistic expression, and I agree that is a very hard point into where the limit of artistic expression and the upholding of autonomy and the prevention of exploitation of humans within the government's jurisdiction ends. I agree that is a very hard line to place, but but when but when you say it's fine as long as there's government regulation into the not topic but into the profession, I think it would become too intrusive and possible and very likely to become corrupt when the government gets into a practice of judging, okay, this individual is or is not a person yet, therefore we can limit their other things. When you keep the general concept vague, people will give a benefit of the doubt and saying, okay, until I learn more, this human is a person. They'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but in so regulating this, you'll get the government coming in and creating not they can't really create an objective system. They could try to be objective as possible, but it would lead to corruption saying, okay, this person or this human is not a person yet and not legalized to engage in prostitution. That would just open up a whole worm of problems from not only from the government involvement in their lives, but from other people within the society being involved in their life, immediately knowing that this person, according to the government, hasn't attained personhood and is only a human.
Okay. Well, I believe at this point then that we've reached an impasse.
Perhaps, well, do you think that it would be a good thing for the government to create an official, like it would be a list or registry of people who are able to and not able to consent? Not
That's
only
what
just
the age.
not
That's
only
what the
based on
age of
age, but this also applies to people with mental defects, mental illnesses, and other basic things.
I would oppose that the same as I would oppose a registry list for gun owners
All right, so then
because it removes.
would you oppose a registry list for prostitutes?
No, no, because it's based on their profession. There's a registry of police officers, there's a registry of firefighters, there's a registry of computer technicians, which I myself was on at one point. I mean, every profession has a registry. That is perfectly fine.
But
However, to say that
isn't that but you said yourself it's the right of people to engage in prostitution, and it says specifically within the Constitution and this registry, and this is something I do agree with anarcho-capitalists about with business licenses. It says specifically in the Constitution that rights shall not be infringed by means of licensing by the
By the
states.
no, 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 by the government? No. However, the market has seen fit to dictate that according to each industry has a registry. I probably still am on a list of registered computer technicians according to CompTIA, a non-governmental private entity.
Okay,
You can
and
have the market dictate that and still operate within the confines of the law.
but then again, that's not regulation. That's just basic market forces. That's not specific regulation imposed by the government. When I
You
when
can
I
have
hear
both.
Yeah, but when I hear you say that there is going to be regulation, that implies to me just not basic forces of taste and preferences within a market, but also a strict enforcement by the government that even if the economy dictates that we want this, there's a demand for this, the government comes in, puts a big stop sign, says absolutely not, it's prohibited. That's what I think of when I think of regulation.
That's not what is meant by regulation. Regulation is meant by enforcing things like a minimum age or certain safety standards.
Well, yeah, and that's also the big stop sign. If there's a big demand for prostitution under that minimum age, even if it's if it's 100%, it'll change. But let's say 60% of the people are saying we're willing to pay top dollar to get a girl a year younger. The government comes in with a big stop sign and says, no, if you do, we'll have your head on a spit for that. Just the general whatever punishment is deemed fit by the state and the voters at large.
And so long as it was done by the will of the demos, I'd be perfectly fine with that. It's the will of the people to say, you know, this is the law. This is, and if we were to set the minimum age to 18, for example, that wouldn't happen. If we were to set the age to 21, there is leeway and there's no reason why it shouldn't. 21 is just the general age that is chosen. Same with drinking. If we were to lower drinking age from 21 to 20, there wouldn't be much of a difference. Now, if we were to drop the drinking age from 21 to 18, there'd be a huge difference.
And you and me are both going under the basic assumption of biological factors in general reached at that particular age. But again, how would you counteract a political movement rejecting that basic concept of a biological point at that particular age, and people saying we need to remove that age or cut it back even more?
That's what the Supreme Court is for. Okay, in the United States, for example, we have specific checks and balances. The Supreme Court can say, no, the legal age is this. And it would, at that point, take an amendment to the Constitution to override that. No executive order could change that. No regular old law could change that. It would have to be a constitutional amendment, which is nearly impossible to do. It's not impossible, it's just extremely impractical.
Indeed, but these people, as many, I mean, you can even come to the assumption that many will subvert the law for their own ideological goals, and this just basic movement of legalizing it would basically empower these various groups, whether they mean to subvert or impose their own ideology of Islamism or whatever have you, to act outside that specific law.
It would be up to the will of the people, so long as it operates within the confines of the law.
But that could also be applied to me. If it's the will of the people and they all vote to make prostitution illegal, then you have to fall back not under whether it's popular by electorate arguments, but whether it should or shouldn't in terms of either functionality or morality.
Okay, and that brings back my question. Do you believe that such a thing can change? As time goes on, do you believe that that can change?
Do I believe what specifically can change? I know you mean the cultural pushes and everything like that, but what specific cultural push against or for?
Yes, in either event. In either event, do you believe that the people can change their mind? So
Well,
currently,
yes,
as
of
it
course.
stands, it is illegal to do so. Do you believe that the will of the people is such that it can change the law? And at that point, does it then not become a part of our culture? Do you believe at that point, if it does become our culture, that it should be that it would or would not violate the consenting party's personhood? If not, why? Or if so, why? Sorry.
Yes, I believe that the culture can change to reflect this, but that particular culture and that the particular institutions voted for and set up by that culture, in this case prostitution, would not be conducive to a functional society. It would in fact be a detriment to the previous institutions and culture.
Irrelevant. Let's say that the culture has changed, that it becomes accepted and or conducive. Do you believe that it violates that consenting party's personhood?
The specific consenting party's personhood, no, but in general it violates the basic rights of various humans.
So, for the majority of people to whom this would not apply, to the majority of people whom, according to your standard, have achieved personhood,
Sure.
do their needs and their desires, are they outweighed by the needs of the few who have not achieved personhood?
Well, I don't think it's the few. I would say, I mean, there's not been a pretty good study, but I think it's probably a 90-10%, 90-10% split. Of course, and I'm not advocating we treat people only as humans as not as persons. I think it's conducive to a functional society that we give people the benefit of the doubt that when we meet another human, we consider them a person. That's just a basic argument of functionality, and also you could say morality too. But
If
hold on, let me just quickly finish this. But protecting that other 90% of humans and just saying, all right, sorry, this one particular act of personhood that you're completely within your right as a person to do, we need to restrict this one particular act, and you don't really. It's not such an evil that it's absolutely demolishing to the rights of the person. It's a particular, necessary evil like taxation that it is worth it to restrict that one particular act of that's within the right of the 10% of the personhood to protect the rights of the 90% of the people who have the possibility to become become functioning persons later.
so, in your view, 90% of the population have not attained personhood.
Um, define population. Are we talking United States population or world population?
Yes.
If
Well,
world,
of whatever 90% you were talking about.
yes, I would say in the world, I would say about 90% of humans have not attained personhood. And like I said before, that doesn't mean that you should treat any human you meet as a human and not as a person. It's conducive to a functional society to treat any human you meet at assuming they are a person until proven otherwise.
Well, I don't know where to go from here then. If you don't believe that 90% of the population are people, then at this point, I think we've reached a total impasse. I don't believe there's any benefit to carrying on this conversation if you're not willing to at least admit more than 10% of the population are people.
Well, for the U.S. population, I think it would be a much better percentage than that. I think it would probably be maybe 55% are humans that are not attained personhood. I mean, I would have to look at official statistics about relative ages and IQs of the nation at large, but based on just what I know about the problems we're having with the number of old people and the number of youths, etc., I would say it's probably like 45% of the U.S. population, legal U.S. population, that participates in surveys and such like that are persons by now, and the rest are, for whatever reason, just humans who have not attained full personhood yet. And no, Evan, in chat, I believe that IQ is kind of like is a well, it's a measure, but the what IQ represents is a tool for how well and how quickly they're able to attain personhood. A person who is mentally retarded is it. You could say it would take much longer for them to it, but just at the rate in the current lifespan, they're most likely a mentally retarded person is unable to attain personhood.
So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move this to the final question. If a law were to be passed currently to to legalize, tax, and regulate it, what would you do? Would there be any way for you to fight it?
Tax and regulate prostitution, and I'm assuming it's set to a legal age of 24 as your ideal scenario.
Sure. Would there be any way for you to fight a law that were to be enacted currently, setting it at 24, regulating and taxing it?
I of course would go through the various legal things, emailing Congress, protest, etc., etc. But like we're also doing in America right now, I would try to get it a cultural shift as well. Convince more people that no, this is not something that we want to tolerate in our society. And although it's legalized, we are going to personally not engage in this practice, and everyone else that we meet, we're also going to try to convince them for it to not be in this practice as well. If prostitution was set at this in this situation as at 24 regulated tax and everything, I don't think that is enough of a point to alone to engage in open revolution. But if it was just made completely legal, no holds barred, I think that would be not completely, but I think that plus another point of just government corruption in general would be enough to justify an armed revolution of the state, saying they're no longer a benefit to our society at large and need to be overthrown and ousted. But in your ideal scenario, no. I think just general protesting and encouragement of cultural rejection would be enough.
Okay, well, this has been enlightening, and I hope that everybody who watches this enjoys watching us bicker about this. Cole, it's been interesting. Thank you for having me on your channel.
Of course. You too, man. Do you have a YouTube channel? Do you want me to place it in the description of the video?
If you wouldn't mind, yeah.
Send it to me over Twitter.
Yeah, can you follow me back so I can just DM it to you? Or
Okay.
It's actually on my Twitter bio.
Okay, sure. And I'll put it in the description.
Thank you. You have a good night, man.
Yep, you too. Have a good day. God bless.
Bye.
And Chad, if you all want to debate me, I think I'm going to organize my channel as kind of a debate channel. So if you want to debate about anything and you have a particular topic that I'm interested in, just send me a message on Twitter and we maybe can get something set up. I'll see you all next time. Hopefully tomorrow if someone comes to debate. See y'all.